Hi, this is my review for No Retreat, the French and Polish fronts. This is in the series of No Retreat games. It's published by GMT. If we have a quick look at the back of the box here, it's a game where you get one map that's double-sided. So there's one kind of game for the Poland 1939 and then a separate for France 1940. There are a few differences between the two. We'll talk about that a little bit. The game is a two-player game. The solitaire suitability they class as a medium, and the complexity is 6, so the higher end of a medium complexity, which broadly speaking I would agree with that. So first up, the rulebook. It's quite a lengthy rulebook. It's around 38 pages in length. It's a good quality book, as you'd expect from GMT. It goes through all the key elements of a player turn, which are quite lengthy. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about the sort of gameplay mechanics. But it goes through all the different phases. I would say the rules are well written. They're well edited, as you'd expect from GMT. They are lengthy, I would describe. This is not a game that you can open up, skim through the rules and then start playing. It is a game that needs a certain amount of study, and then placing out some counters and trying out some of the different mechanics. And it's not because there's any particular rules that are complex or in-depth. It just has quite a lot of them. So combat is actually quite straightforward. I'll talk about combat. Movement's quite straightforward. There are some mechanics and gameplay components that make this game quite unique and therefore quite interesting, that are probably a bit more detailed. We're particularly using the cards and the initiative counters. I'll talk about that. But overall, the rulebook, as you can see, it's nicely laid out. It's, as I said, I found it generally well written. I would say that it's a rulebook that will take several readings to understand some of the game, and I would recommend that once read a few times, you kind of lay out some counters and try and just do some of the sort of parts of the game. But yeah, so they've done a good job. It is just, it is lengthy. There are lots of optional rules as well, which is good. As you can see, advanced rules and optional rules for a little bit more historical flavour in there. It doesn't need those too much. I played with a few. The game has plenty of chrome, mostly through the card use. It does have a great index as well, which is great. You will be using that. In all my playthroughs, I would say I had to consult the rulebook at some point in every game that I played of this game. But yeah, great job. In addition to the rulebook, you get a playbook. This is around the same sort of page count, 34, 35, 36 pages, something like that. This has the different scenarios for the game. So, as I said, this game it's a game of sort of two games, really. One is the France game and one is the Poland game. So it details the setup for the French game. There's a smaller Dunkirk styled scenario as well, which actually only uses half the map. So to learn the game, those smaller scenarios might be suitable, or if you haven't got quite so much time, then you can use one of the smaller scenarios. So that's welcome. So you have 3 scenarios for the France game, and then for the Polish, you've got the regular campaign game, a historical campaign game as well, and a couple of others. So again, a nice number of scenarios. Then what this book really is then is the examples of play, which are really good. It's a very detailed example of play where they painstakingly take you through every single component of every single phase. This is quite a good way to learn the game, where you basically set the game out as they have done, and read through and play through exactly the same points. It will help you understand the mechanics. Obviously, it's an investment of time on your part to do so, but I found it a good way of learning the game and understanding some of the intricacies of the game, of which there are many. So I thought this was great, very well written, very thorough, and they do that for some of the specific scenarios. So if you're playing the Warsaw scenario, for example, on the Poland game, you can go straight to here and just set this up as they have done and play through and read through the all those as well, which is great. Then in addition to that, as we get towards the end of the book, there are designer notes, and there's some nice player notes as well, and some history as well, which is always welcome. So that was that was really good. It was a great read, this book. I enjoyed it immensely, and it definitely helps you appreciate and understand the game a lot better. So yeah, great job. So next up, components. This is the France 1940 map that you can see, sort of most of it. There we go. The map art is very nice. You can clearly see the contents of each hex. The readability of the map is very good. The map is mounted and lays flat very nicely. It's not a huge map, so the footprint on your table isn't huge. Which is great. The counters are really nice and big and chunky. They pop really easy from the they punch out really nicely. Again, high quality. The counter art is NATO symbols for the most part, apart from the armor, and is very readable. There aren't a huge number of stats on the counter. Really, it's just the value for combat and the movement, plus historical information. So when you see on the board, it's the game looks great, and the quality is very high, and very durable. I've played this game quite a few times now, it's great quality as you'd expect from GMT. In addition, you get a couple of player aids. So here we have the sequence of play. And as you can see, this is the sequence of play. So there's quite a few phases to the sequence of play, which is great. You also get a sheet that details the setup for both the France 1940 game, and you used to get a separate one. Just reaching over and grabbing it, you get a separate one for the that's the Polish 1939 game. As I said, the board's double mounted. Sorry, it's double sided. So you just turn it over for the Polish game. Here's your terrain effects chart. Terrain effects chart, very straightforward. If you're familiar with hex-based war games, there's nothing in there that really threw me or surprised me. It's exactly as you'd expect. The enemy do have a zone of control. It costs another movement point to enter. The movement points are on the counters. Very straightforward. One of the interesting things, again, people familiar with these types of games will be familiar with this. There is a defense shift of columns from the terrain. The actual combat. This is probably worth just mentioning for a second, actually. There are multiple combat tables depending on A, who is the attacker, and B, what type of attack they are doing. Specifically, the Germans. The Germans can perform mobile combat table. So you've got armor counters, for example, and they can also perform blitzkrieg assault table. So if you're performing a blitzkrieg assault, you'll use that table. If you're performing a mobile combat, you'll use this table. Everything else, prepared combat generally. There is a German fortress if it's in the defender's hex, and there's the normal allied prepared and the allied mobile as well. So what this does in effect is when you're playing the game and you're working out which table you use, it does require that extra step. You've got to make sure you're using the right table before you start rolling your dice. But you get a play rate, like I said, you get a play rate for that, which is great. You're going to be using this all the time, so you'll need that out at all points. and you do get you get 2 of those, which is for both players, which is great. In addition, the game has a lot of cards. Cards are very nice, very durable. The cards have information for, depending on who's playing the card, for the Axis or for the Allies. But yeah, the cards and the again, high quality, very durable. So yeah, component-wise, the game is great, as you'd expect from GMT. High quality components all around. One thing I actually forgot to mention, which is strange, it's one of the most important things of the game, is the victory point track, British stance track, and the turn track itself. And these have sections where you're going to move counters to, depending on what happens in the game. So in the France game, you have secret plans. Units that get destroyed get placed here. You can pay resources, use the cards as resources to bring them back into the game. Surrendered units and evacuated units. Obviously, for the France game, the player may wish to evacuate units from Dunkirk, Calais, Dieppe, as you want in the game. And this is great. So I'm going to talk about the things that I like about the game. The actual core mechanics for a hex and counter game are quite straightforward. As you can see, there's not a huge amount of counters, and even if I just this is the France 1940 game set up here. There aren't a huge number of counters. I think one of the things this series of games is known for is its low counter density, which means that you can focus on the counters that you're using. I found playing the game, and that's nice, that's good. However, do not think that this is a simple game because it doesn't have many counters, because it is not. But before we get into that, just talk about the actual core mechanics. Movement and combat are very straightforward. Movement, you have a movement allowance per counter. You have a terrain effects chart. You simply look at what the terrain you're moving into as to what the cost is. Very straightforward. And even if you're playing someone who is not familiar with these type of war games, because it's so straightforward, they'll instantly understand the mechanics I found. The same is true for combat. The combat is an odds-based system, as I've described. So you look at the right table depending on the combat you're doing. You work out the odds between the attacker and the defender, and any contributing factors, which I'll sort of come to in a minute. But there's things that each player can do to move that column across to their advantage. And again, it's very straightforward. You roll the dice, you cross-reference that, and you look at the back of the sheet, and it tells you what the result is, and you can decipher the result. Very, very, very straightforward. At first look, you might look at this game and go, it's low counter density, there's not huge stacks. Broadly speaking, you've got 2 counters per stack. This setup I've done a mixture of 2 and 1. So not huge stacks of counters, not many counters. The map isn't too big. Movement's very straightforward. Combat's very straightforward. This would mean this is a very simple game. It's not. This is where this game sort of is unique and is different than most other war games. Yes, all those things are true. Combat straightforward, movement straightforward. The results of the combat is very straightforward, right? And that's great. What this game does, and I'll try and describe it as best I can. It introduces a few mechanics that add huge amounts of chrome and a lot of layers, I'll describe it. And it's mostly around the cards. Let's just move that player radar for a minute. These cards and these initiative counters. And I'm going to use a couple of the most straightforward ones that I can find. Effectively, every turn, the players will receive a number of cards that can be played either immediately, or they can play during their turn or their opponent's turn. The cards have 2 descriptions on them, one per player. So if I'm the German player and I take this card and I'm using the Axis part of the card. I haven't got time to go into every detail about what all the cards do, but effectively they are events that will mostly go in my favour, that I can play at certain points of the game, that will enable me to perform strategies to help me try and achieve my victory points, or they will hinder the opponent in doing so. They can also be traded to bring back any step loss. So some of the counters have steps, not all of them. This counter, for example, doesn't have a step, so one casualty needs to be removed, whereas this counter would have a step on the back of it. So I can trade these cards in to replace those steps. So effectively they can be used as resource points, or I can bring counters back into the game that have been destroyed and removed by trading in my cards. I get a set number of cards per turn, and so forth. What they in reality do is, as I said, you have to very, very carefully use these cards at the right time, the right opportunity to gain every advantage that you can. In combination with those, you get these initiative, I think they're called initiative counters. Each player gets a certain number of initiative counters per turn. You use these as a resource to use your cards, or you use them to help increase your chances or improve your chances in combat effectively, both as a defender and as the attacker. So the attacker might say, German player say, "Oh, I'm going to this is a target. This counter is going to attack that counter. I'm going to use a blitz counter," and the allied player may have a defending counter to use against that, and that adds that extra layer. In addition to that, each player has a number of target counters, and the Axis player has more than the Allied player. So the Axis player can every turn target and effectively do more combat than the opposing player. You cannot, in this example here, have all these counters, attack all these counters in your turn. You have to pick and choose the counters you want to be targeted. In addition to that, the opposing player can counter target and so forth. So there's these layer of extra mechanics through these quite simple, almost innocent looking components, cards and little counters, right? And they add basically the depth to the gameplay. They add the strategy to the game. They add the brilliant when you're playing two-player. I'm going to use this card, and you see the opponent groan at that point in the game. They add that to the game, which is absolutely brilliant and a lot of fun. And a lot of these counters have historic chrome to them as well. In addition to this, you have leader cards, and all these different types of mechanics just add and add and add. What it does do is make a game that deceptively just looks like a low density counter, straightforward hex encounter type war game into something that's quite different than it actually first appears. And for some people that's going to be great, especially in two-player. Which brings me on to solitaire. So I played the game two-player and I played it solitaire as well. Effectively, it plays solitaire okay, in the sense of everything's straightforward, the mechanics are all straightforward as the two-player game. What I would say with the solitaire game is you're going to lose a lot because of the fact that you're using so many cards. I've tried playing it solitaire where I'm using the cards as I would two-player, and it's worked okay. You're just going to lose that card play element to it. There is no out of the box, there is no bot for the solitaire, there's no solitaire mode or anything like that. You're playing both sides to the best of their abilities, and you definitely, I would say, playing solitaire, lose that card play. You lose a certain element with these initiative counters. Even with the target counters, you lose a little bit that you do have strong in two-player. So overall thoughts, great components, Straightforward mechanics for movement and combat. Lots of layers of additional mechanics that is not for the faint of heart, I would say. They do take a bit of time to understand because there's so many different layers. The player turn, for example, has loads of different phases through it. It's not a simple move and fight battle type war game. Excuse me, the cards add that, the counters add that, the initiative counters, sorry. And that adds a huge layer of depth of strategy, depth of decision making to the player. I think this is and this shines as a two-player game, I would say. You will lose some of that in solitaire, playing it solo, playing it on your own. You're going to lose some of that, no two ways about it. But for a two-player game, it adds huge amounts. So as I said, I enjoyed playing it, particularly two-player. I enjoyed playing it solitaire as well, but I felt that it lacks something solitaire because of it's much harder to play solitaire with this card play and these initiative counters that you lose when playing it two-player. But great components, a lot of fun. You can play this in an evening. I would say I've been mostly talking, using the France 1940 example. The Poland example is the Polish front is, I felt, more one-sided. I think you can win it as the Polish. I think it's harder than maybe the France one is. Having played both, I'll be honest, I've played the France one a lot more than the Polish one, for example. Played the Polish one, but it was fun, but I felt the France one was probably for me, it was a little bit better balanced. Yeah, huge amounts of chrome in the cards, which is great. Huge amounts of historical. The rule books are good. They're just, again, in depth. They're going to take a bit of time to digest and work out the rules. But yeah, overall, a great game to play in an evening. A great game to play in an evening with an opponent who knows the game as well. I think if you know the game more than your opponent does, it's not going to be that well balanced. But a great game for an evening where both of you know the game as well as each other, definitely. And it can be played solitaire. You're just going to lose some of those elements. So yeah, great stuff. Another great game from GMT. And thanks for watching.